Hey guys, and welcome back to another Let Me Explain video. Today's topic is the Hobbit Trilogy is underrated. So if you disagree with me, let me explain. The Hobbit Trilogy is obviously the film series by Peter Jackson, the prequels to the Lord of the Rings film series, which he filmed also. And since these Hobbit films have come out, they've largely been regarded as underwhelming, disappointing, and some might even say bad or terrible. And the sentiment across them has been, I'd say, negative more than positive. But one thing that has to be remembered though is that the Lord of the Rings film series is, in my opinion, the greatest film series of all time. And I think a lot of people do agree with that sentiment, or at least believe that it is up there as one of the best. And so when they decided to come along and make The Hobbit into a film series, it was always the odds were always stacked against it, in that the Lord of the Rings series were already regarded as at the top. In order to reach that peak was going to be a very tough challenge. And ultimately, they didn't reach it. But I'm here to say that just because it didn't reach it doesn't mean it's not a great film series as well, and therefore is underrated. So before I get into the key reasons as to why I believe it is underrated, I think it's worth noting that The Hobbit versus The Lord of the Rings from the books are two very different books. They are both great in completely different ways, but I think no one would really argue with the fact that the Lord of the Rings book series is far superior to the Hobbit book. One, because it is far more dense, covers a lot more story and plot and characters and everything, whilst the Hobbit book is also great, but it is a children's book. So the comparison there can almost not be made. They're almost worlds apart in terms of the tone and the themes and the stakes and everything that they have between them. And so because the Lord of the Rings book series is superior, it is only logical to conclude that the film series would also be superior if filmed to the same quality. So The Hobbit already had this upward hill battle that it was never going to be as good a film series as The Lord of the Rings, purely because the source material is not as good. So no matter how well the films could be made, because the Lord of the Rings films were made and were made so well, it was just never going to be able to meet that task of being superior to the Lord of the Rings films. So with that said, I believe there are 5 key reasons as to why the Hobbit film series is in fact underrated. And let me get started. So these reasons are in no particular order, but the first key reason that I would like to cover is the use of the appendices. So the Hobbit book is very small, is very short, and does not have excessive detail, but they chose to turn it into a film trilogy. And so turning into a film trilogy was always going to be a difficult task. You know, we could talk for days about whether that was the right decision or not, but they went with it. And the reason they went with it is because they wanted to incorporate these other stories from the appendices into The Hobbit. These stories that take place at the same time as The Hobbit, and they felt could actually increase the weight and the stakes of the film series that they wanted to tell. So the main story from the appendices that they bring into The Hobbit is the story of Dol Guldur. So Gandalf's journey to Dol Guldur to investigate the necromancer that turns out to be Sauron. This is mentioned in the Hobbit novel, but it is not shown in any way. Gandalf simply disappears, and then he returns at the Battle of the Five Armies in the book, and that is it. It's little to nothing is said about it. But the filmmakers, Peter Jackson, took this as an opportunity to show and explore that story, but not only just show and explore it for the sake of filling time in these movies, but he actually used it to tie into what is the already existing Lord of the Rings film series, to kind of show an origin story for Sauron, for how he came from Dol Guldur, was building an army there, that it was involved with the Battle of the Five Armies. That does change the story of The Hobbit. That is not what happens, but that said, it does show, you know, the true lore of the story, where Gandalf, the White Council, being Gandalf, Saruman, Galadriel, and Elrond, come together to basically banish Sauron from Dol Guldur, and where then he flies off to Mordor to then start, obviously, his armies there, which leads into the Lord of the Rings. I love that storyline from the book. I thought it is really well executed, not just from a storytelling standpoint, but even the filming. Like, they made it really tense, and it was a nice change of pace, particularly in the Desolation of Smaug, the second film in the Hobbit series. I thought it was great to kind of have that other side of the coin, where you've got Bilbo and the dwarves on their journey to Erebor, but then you also had this side story with Gandalf, and I thought that was really cool to see. It just kind of got to explore new parts of Middle-earth that we hadn't seen before on screen, and it just brought extra tension, in my opinion, to the story, and I really enjoyed that storyline. And obviously Azog as well is drawn from the appendices. Many things throughout the Hobbit films are drawn from the appendices, and I thought they brought them together really nicely to really up the stakes of the Hobbit series and tie it in well to the Lord of the Rings film series. And so, when he was considering that it's going to now be a 6-film series with 2 trilogies, I think it was a really good judgment to make these inclusions so that they mold together nicely, because the Hobbit book and the Lord of the Rings book are almost they're very loosely connected. Very few mentions between them that allude to the other, but in the film series they kind of tried to tie it together, and I like that, and I enjoyed those inclusions. The second key reason for why I believe these films are underrated is that some key scenes from the book are executed perfectly in the film. So the key scenes that I have in mind that I would like to highlight is starting off in the first film, An Unexpected Journey, the introduction to Bilbo and the dwarves arriving at Bag End. I think that is a perfectly made scene in the film. I think it conveys the book perfectly, it captures the vibe, the relationships between Bilbo and the dwarves and how they behave. Obviously it's a reintroduction to Middle Earth. We hadn't been in Middle Earth for maybe almost 10 years at that point, since Return of the King. And so now it was a nice way to bring us back into the world. But it was also just a perfectly executed scene from the book. Just from going from page to screen was just done perfectly. Another scene that I can think of is later on in An Unexpected Journey, which is the riddles in the dark between Bilbo and Gollum. That is a fantastic scene. The page just comes to life. It's perfectly executed. Andy Serkis as Gollum is always a win, and Martin Freeman as Bilbo did a great job throughout the whole film series. And that scene just comes to life. And when I say it's perfectly executed, it's how you imagine it in the books. Like when you are reading the book, you see it, you're imagining it, and it just looks almost exactly the way you imagine it. So I thought that was great. And I could name other scenes, like in A Desolation of Smaug, the scene where Bilbo goes into Erebor with the mountains of gold. That looks perfect. It looks exactly how I imagined it when I was reading it in the book. So I think meeting Beorn as well, there was another great scene, especially if you've watched the extended editions. There's just so many great things throughout, and obviously the spiders in Mirkwood, like they expanded on that scene, turned it into a whole action set piece. But just the whole scene of where they're getting lost in the woods and everything like that just really captured very well. And so I thought just a lot of scenes throughout the whole trilogy just translate really well from page to screen, and I have no problem with them. The third key reason I'd say for this film being underrated is the acting performances. I think across the board the performances are top notch. Obviously you've got Ian McKellen back as Gandalf, you got Martin Freeman in the role of Bilbo, and then all the dwarves. Just everyone is conveyed perfectly, in my opinion. They brought the characters to life so well. You've got some returning characters with Hugo Weaving as Elrond, or Kate Blanchett as Galadriel, and Christopher Lee as Saruman. Like everyone does their role perfectly. So the performances are great. I have no issue with that. And I think even other people who do criticize these films probably will admit too that the performances there's no problem with them. And so yeah, I think that's just another reason why this film is underrated. Following on from what I just mentioned about the performances is what I would say the character depth in these films, which is the fourth reason for why I believe it's underrated. The book of The Hobbit does not go into much detail in terms of depth, especially with the dwarves. A lot of them are very two-dimensional. And obviously it's a children's book, so that is to be expected, but they're quite two-dimensional. And these films really, because it is a trilogy, that's these 3 long films that are adapting a very small novel, they really got to take time with a lot of the dwarves and get to know them and build their personalities a bit so that we can kind of appreciate them and actually feel something for them. Because one of the things in the book is that, especially when some of the key characters die, like Thorin and Fili and Kili, it's almost a throwaway line. Like there's no real meaning to it. Whereas because we got to invested in these characters, got to know them, they created some relationships with them. Now people have differing views about the inclusion of Tauriel, who's a made-up character, and her relationship with Feely or Keely, I can't remember which one. Yeah, like that, and the three-way and the love triangle with Legolas. People have opinions on that. I don't love it either. But anyways, it is what it is. That said, it created more depth for these characters so that when they were killed, it meant more. And there was a lot of weight to it, and there were actually emotional scenes. So yeah, I think the depth in these films of the characters was rich. And even Legolas. I know Legolas was included in these films just simply for nostalgia and to have those cool action scenes with him. But even then, they managed to give some like crumbs of depth to his character and backstory that we knew nothing about at least from the Lord of the Rings film series. So I think it was nice across the board. As I said, the acting was great, but on top of that, because the acting was great, they were able to contribute to the character depth there, and to me, that was fantastic to see. So the fifth and final reason as to why I believe this film series is severely underrated is, in what I would say, an epic story, is the making it into an epic story. And what do I mean by that? So, as I said, the Hobbit book is a children's adventure book. It does not have the stakes or the epicness of the Lord of the Rings book series and film series. It is simply a children's adventure book. But Peter Jackson took this opportunity to turn it into an epic trilogy of proportions similar to that of the Lord of the Rings. Obviously, the ramifications of what's taking place in The Hobbit is not as grand as is Lord of the Rings, but still he made it as grand as possible. And I quite love that, because coming off of Lord of the Rings, I think a lot of audiences would have found it hard to enjoy the Hobbit films if they were just simply lower scales and lower stakes, I should say. And so I think including these stories from the appendices and including these extra character depths and making these larger battles, particularly with the Battle of the Five Armies, it just helped increase the stakes of this film series so that it leaves a lasting imprint. And I think it did that. It's a much more epic tale because of all these extra inclusions that weren't in the book. If they had just adapted what was in the book to screen, I think you could have a nice little almost children's film or family film, one film that would just tell the tale and be out the door and wouldn't really be remembered. And I think while some people would argue these films are not very well remembered compared to the Lord of the Rings, I dare say that they are better off for the fact that they had these extra inclusions rather than not having them, because I don't know what we would have thought of this if it was a one film made and that just adapted the book as it was. I think it might have just been dusted off into the wind if it came out like that. So yeah, I think having this epic and grander scale just helped. I think it just helped it across the board. I think it helps us keep invested for 3 films, and it helped also keep a consistent tone with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because the Lord of the Rings obviously is very high stakes and very serious and very heavy. So I think it could have felt like a very different universe almost if they just went with the tone of the Hobbit book. But I think by going for that more epic tone, it kind of creates a more consistent feel throughout all 6 films now. And I think that works better in the long term for people's enjoyment of these films over the years as we go by. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Hobbit trilogy. I've thought this for a long time, and I wanted to put my thoughts onto video, and I hope it's convincing to you somewhat. But I would love to know your thoughts in the comment section below. Did you love these films when they came out? Were you disappointed by them? Did you want to see more? Did you want to see less? Did you think they should have left that thing out or included this thing? Whatever it was, I want to hear all about it. So I could go on for days about these films, and I love this film series. It's one of my favorites, and yeah, it's just, I firmly believe that it is a very underrated film. If you haven't seen it in a long time, I encourage you, go watch it again. I think you might be pleasantly surprised as to how well it has aged. So yeah, that's my Let Me Explain video, and we'll see you all next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye.